single day, like I've always done and always will.
Passing these bills on the floor, making yet another stand.
Welcome to this week's edition of New York Now. I'm Chantal Destra. In recent months, there has been major concern over cuts stemming from the federal Big Beautiful Bill. In New York, state lawmakers and elected officials have been sounding the alarm on how the legislation would negatively impact the Medicaid program and SNAP benefits in New York. The state comptroller's office, which is in charge of looking at the overall financial health of the state, is also indicating that New York will face an uphill battle in mitigating these cuts. In this next segment, we'll sit down with State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli for an in-depth analysis of the federal cuts, the future of state budgets ahead, and unclaimed funds for New Yorkers. Here's that conversation. Thank you so much for joining us here today, Comptroller.
Great to be back in the studio with you.
Now, it's no secret that federal funding takes up a good portion of the state's budget. There's been a lot of concern this year about cuts to federal funding stemming from the Big Beautiful Bill. So as the state comptroller, I wanted to get your perspective on the bill's impact on the state.
Yeah, certainly not a positive impact. And, you know, you're right. In any given year, 35 to 40% of the state budget is federal money that comes through. And the budget the year that we're in right now is counting on about $94 billion of federal money coming in. It was one of the concerns when the budget was being put together that we had expressed that without knowing the numbers, we knew that something negative was going to be coming out of the process in Washington. Well, now we certainly have a better idea. And the hits are significant, particularly in terms of health care, Medicaid dollars. Just in that area, looking at the impact, especially with what's called the Essential Plan. For the current year budget, we're looking at a loss of funding about $750 million, and that will get larger next year, about $3 billion, and that's just primarily looking at healthcare. When you add in SNAP, used to be called food stamps, you know, the nutrition programs, education, some of the environmental programs related to clean energy and climate change and so on, it's going to be a challenge to navigate that. And one of the other issues is that not all of these cuts will take effect right away. Some is going to be phased in over time. Some of them will come in after the next round of midterm elections. I don't think that's a coincidence. So we have to look at that. And it's not just cuts. It's also increased administrative costs. So you're looking at some very significant impacts, particularly with regard to health care.
And I know your office recently put out a report really focused on the impact on food insecurity in the state because of these federal cuts. Yeah. Why do you think this is such a big issue for a state like New York?
Well, you know, New York, we're viewed as a wealthier state than many other states, and that's certainly true, but we're also a very diverse state. And, you know, when you look at the numbers, we found that about 1 in 8 households in New York were suffering from food insecurity. You know, some of that relates to challenges that came out of the pandemic, but during the pandemic, there was additional support for programs, including nutrition programs. Those federal dollars, that pandemic aid is, you know, largely gone now. So we're starting to see that impact once again. 1 in 8, that's a pretty big percentage of households that are suffering. So when you cut back on a program like SNAP, you're only going to make those numbers worse. And that's really a concern. Look, we see the impact of inflation. Everybody's feeling it, especially at the grocery store. And certainly if you're a family that already has limited funds to provide for food, and you rely on something like SNAP, the SNAP program, again, what we used to call food stamps, cutbacks there, where again, there are changes in eligibility, increased administrative costs, and bottom line cuts, it just spells for, I think, a lot of pain for too many families.
And on the cuts to Medicaid, we know that the state each and every year spends a lot of money in the state budget to that program. Yep. So how do you think the governor and state lawmakers should approach funding to that program in the years to come, given these federal cuts, in a way that is financially sustainable for the state?
It's going to be a challenge. I think it has to be a combination of factors. I mean, look, let's hope that at some point there'll be a change in political direction where some of the cuts that will be coming down the road won't exactly come to pass. But putting that aside, I think we're going to have to be careful if we do any cuts in spending, make sure that people don't get hurt. The state does have some reserves, not as high an amount as I've argued for in the past, but there is some money there to backstop. May not be able to cover it all. You know, going back in recent weeks, it was estimated that on Medicaid alone, we could be looking at over $13 billion loss. It's a pretty significant loss. Again, we have to see what the actual numbers are. But I would hope with the Medicaid program particularly, we would also use this as a challenge to figure out how we could be more efficient and effective with how we're spending the money. You know, our office does audits all the time on the Medicaid program, and we often identify opportunities to save money because of inefficiency. Sometimes there's fraud, but it's really more a question of inefficiency and waste, how the program can be run more tightly, more effectively, without hurting people getting services. So I think the challenge is going to be to really see what the numbers are going to be. The first year hit is one I'm sure we could manage. It's as we see the multi-billion-dollar impact in the out years, we're going to have to be a bit more careful. Keep in mind for the state budget, even with the generous state budget that was enacted this year, it was already assumed there were going to be out-year budget gaps that were growing. Well, now with these federal cuts, now that we're seeing the actual numbers, those out-year gaps are just going to grow. Not just in terms of health care, but programs for education, for seniors, for environment, for housing, go down the long list. It's going to be a challenging few years of budgeting here in New York.
And the governor does have executive authority to make midstream cuts to the state budget and changes given federal cuts coming down up to a certain amount. So can you help us understand how this all works?
Yeah, very good point. That was one of the contingencies that was put in. Again, I would have liked to have seen a little more put in reserve, but instead the flexibility given to the executive through the division of the budget to have cuts up to $2 billion. And, you know, as the governor just announced, she's looking at the budget now and calling on agencies to save money to address that $750 million hit that we have in the current year budget. The provision in there also is that if the legislature would have a different opinion as to where any cutbacks should be, they have 10 days, I think it is, to come back, come up with an alternate program. You know, so, you know, I'm sure the governor won't take that action without consulting, you know, with partners and trying to build a consensus. But it's good. That's going to be the first real pencil sharpening and really looking at the bottom line that I think is going to be more typical of what we're going to be living with for many, many months, if not years to come.
And looking at the budget in the years to come, how do you think the governor and state lawmakers should be approaching the budget in a way that is conservative and also addresses not only the reality of federal cuts, but also the increasing cost of inflation and, you know, tariffs on goods?
Yeah, you know, a very good point. That tariff question really affects the overall economy. You know, so the question is, if the economy is going to start to slow down, and we also know there are parts of our state that still have not grown back all the jobs that were lost during the pandemic, what will be the impact on economic activity, and what will be the impact on tax revenue? That's why we have to look at it carefully. You know, I think what it means is that instead of just when we're working on next year's budget, just adding to whatever is there, really scrutinize the spending and see if there are ways to be more efficient, to still deliver the service, but in a more cost-effective way. We don't always do that as well as we should in government generally, so I think that challenge is there. You know, and some argue that it shouldn't just be on the spending side, but you need to look at the, you know, the tax revenue side. You know, some argue for increased taxes, particularly on higher income New Yorkers. I think it's always important to point out that higher income folks are already paying a bit more. And, you know, one of the challenges that we have been losing some taxpayers. Not everybody's leaving New York State, contrary to what the critics say. But, you know, keep in mind the state is very dependent on personal income tax revenue. You know, and roughly the top 2% of taxpayers carry close to 50% of the tax burden that comes in as far as personal income tax collection. So making the right choices about appropriate tax level, not an exact science, but something we have to be mindful of. So I would always say, you know, start at the point of saying, what's the appropriate spending level? Can we be more efficient with how we're spending money? That should be the first effort. And let's not resort to more borrowing to solve our problems as well. That's also been a pattern that's, you know, New York has fallen into in past years. You know, we're a very highly indebted state. That's not a good position to be in, especially as we're navigating more challenging times. So I think it's going to be a tall order for the legislature and the governor. I'm sure they're up to it because New Yorkers expect a lot in terms of services. We have a lot of people that are struggling to get through this tough time, and they depend on government services. We talked about a few of them. We have a lot of other issues that people need help on. Housing is obviously a big issue, across the state in many ways. So it's going to be a very interesting time in government, a very challenging time. But, I also believe in the strength of New York and the wisdom of New Yorkers. We'll get through this, and we'll do it in a way that we are going to make sure that no one gets unreasonably hurt, despite what Washington is throwing our way.
And lastly, I know your office has been doing a lot of awesome work around unclaimed funds for New Yorkers. So can you tell us about that work? And, the process if a New Yorker wants to claim some funds.
Well, this is the fun part of the job. I always tell people, go to our website, and whatever, put in New York State Comptroller, whatever your search engine is, click on unclaimed funds. Unclaimed funds are, we call it lost money. People may have old bank accounts that may have moved, the bank lost track of you, you didn't update your contact information. You may have had a health insurance check that was never cashed, or an old utility security deposit check that wasn't cashed. Again, often it's because people move and contact is lost, or sometimes people left money by somebody. It's an inherited situation. There are various ways that these kinds of dollars or accounts are declared what we call abandoned property, turned over to the state for safekeeping. Those accounts never expire. And we've been trying to remind New Yorkers, especially during tough times, this is your money, we want to get it back to you. So we have many ways that we publicize going to our website, because you can actually now search right online, apply right online if it's a quick match. We're doing something else new starting this year, where for any new claim coming in $250 or less, we're having an expedited process where if we have the valid information, we will actually mail the check directly to you before you have to come to us. In the past, it was, you come to us or we'll find you and then we'll ask you to submit a claim. Now we'll just send that check out. So using that expedited process, actually, we've returned about $5 million just so far this year. And we're up to, believe it or not, returning about $2 million a day to New Yorkers. But more money keeps coming in. Gift cards is a new area when they expire that, it's turned over to us. So we keep the accounts in safekeeping. But certainly during tough times, we want New Yorkers to get their money. So I do hope your viewers will, if they haven't heard of the program, go to our website, click on unclaimed funds. And I always remind people, it could be in your personal name, any organization you're attached to, or it could be in the name of a deceased parent or grandparent. If it's an inheritance situation, we made a little more documentation. But a lot of these accounts go back many decades, people who passed away, organizations that are defunct. So we may need more proof that you're connected to it, but there are many ways you may be part of those unclaimed funds.
Well, that is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us here today, Comptroller.
I enjoyed the conversation. Look forward to coming back.
And we were speaking with Tom DiNapoli, Comptroller for the state of New York. And for more information on the impact of federal cuts on New York, you can visit our website. That's at nynow.org. Now turning to another important topic. During the legislative session, state lawmakers were pushing for a bill that would allow for grocery stores and supermarkets to sell wine in the state. But even with changes and amendments, the bill ultimately was not able to make it over the legislative finish line. Our Elise Klein spoke with supporters and critics of the bill to understand its legislative future. Here's that story.
In 40 other states across the country, you can buy wine in grocery stores. New York is one of 10 states that doesn't allow it. Some New York State lawmakers want to change this with legislation that would legalize the sale of wine in grocery stores. State Senator Liz Krueger, a Democrat representing the Upper East Side in Manhattan and a lead sponsor of the bill, says New York is out of the norm and passing this bill would have benefits for consumers and wineries.
It will very likely decrease the costs because it's increasing the competition for where you can buy it. And of course, it also, the way we structure the bill, gives priority incentives to the sale of New York State wine. And one of the purposes of this legislation is to support our local wine and grape industry. So we see this as a win-win-win for New York.
Kruger asserts that the issue of wine in grocery stores is popular among the public. According to a 2025 Siena poll, nearly 80% of New Yorkers support the sale of wine in grocery stores.
It's clearly responsive to the opinion of the vast majority of consumers.
Assemblymember Pam Hunter, a Democrat representing Syracuse and the lead sponsor of the bill in the Assembly, says the state needs to legalize wine in supermarkets because the state's liquor laws are outdated and don't reflect how consumers shop today.
I think the benefit really is ultimately the convenience for consumers. Overwhelmingly, whether it's Democrats, Republicans, Independents, over 75% of constituents across the state are asking for and are supporting this. So we're listening to consumers. We're listening to people who want this.
Paul Zuber, the executive vice president with the Business Council of New York State, a supporter of the bill, says this legislation will also make New York more competitive.
And I think that competition has been even more heightened over the years because of technology. When other states are able to provide the simplicities of life, it's very, very difficult for us to make the argument to companies that want to come here.
While the bill seems to be quite popular among New Yorkers and some advocate groups, it has strong opposition from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, as well as wine and liquor store owners. Michael Carrera, owner of Michael Towney Wine and Spirits and the executive director of the Metropolitan Package Store Association, says this legislation would be a game changer for the industry and have a devastating impact on local wine and liquor stores.
If wine went into groceries, the consumer would stop buying wine and liquor stores, and they would buy it in groceries. There would not be more wine consumers. There wouldn't be more wine sales. They would just buy wine at the rich companies that are owned by Amazon, like Whole Foods and all sorts of big companies like that, and small independent businesses that we represent, that's what we are. Local, small Main Street businesses will be out of business.
Local wine and liquor store owners like Tony Russo in White Plains say the legislation would make business harder at a time when the cost of doing business is becoming more expensive.
So everything is skyrocketing. Again, as I said before, drive down any main street and see how many open stores you have. What does that tell you? Not only our business, and our business is impacted the same way. We have a select group of items that we sell. I can't sell everything. I can sell wine, I can sell liquor. I can't even sell, a non-alcoholic wine, right? So now you're going to take away half of my business.
Russo says for his dad, who migrated from Italy during the Great Depression, a wine and liquor store was his way to make a living, and that holds for many communities today.
Think about the immigrants today and how hard they work. You're taking all that American dream away from these guys. How do you start a business today? The way my dad did, the way, and that goes back a while. Even come 30 years, 40 years, it's impossible. The competition that you face, the amount of money that it takes.
For some store owners, their livelihood also keeps a family legacy alive. Stefan Kalagridis, owner of Colvin Wine in Albany, took over for his dad, who started the business in the 70s.
It's been a family business for so many years. I put two of my sons through college, and I've been making a fair living.
Kalagridis says he's very worried he could be forced to close down his business, which has been in his family for about 25 years, if this law is passed.
I have a mortgage to pay. I have a lease here. I have employees. I don't think, I have 4 employees. I may lose their job. Yeah, it's going to be very detrimental to our business.
Sandeep Patel, the manager of New York State Wine and Liquor Warehouse, says wine and liquor stores like the one he manages will simply not be able to compete.
We cannot compete dollar to dollar with a big box store because they have deep pockets. They can wheel and deal with the suppliers. They can get a much lower pricing than we can.
Toward the end of the last legislative session at the Capitol, lawmakers made amendments to the bill in an effort meant to mitigate small owners' concerns. The amendment would allow wine and liquor stores to also sell snacks, mixers, and cigarettes, which they currently cannot do under the state's liquor laws. The amendment also establishes a 500-foot rule prohibiting a wine and grocery store license within 500 feet of an existing wine or liquor store. Some state lawmakers feel this is a good compromise.
Stores that have only been able to sell liquor and wine up until now have had some concerns including the fact that they would like to be able to sell other products and have been prevented from doing so. This bill allows them to do so. And this bill also reflects respect for their concern about next door competition.
Hunter stresses they are making an effort to listen to stakeholders' concerns.
We are not closing the door to anyone. We've had significant conversations with, like I said, stakeholders and independent liquor stores, and that's why we introduced most of these amendments, because of the concerns coming from these smaller independent liquor stores.
However, many store owners and lawmakers alike don't feel this amendment does enough to address their concerns.
We don't want any of that. That's just an attempt on their part to placate us so that they can, do a quid pro quo. We're not interested in any of that. And it's certainly not an even exchange.
Patel says he doesn't think this change to the bill will help stores.
I don't think it's a solution. It's just something, it's like a sop that they give you when they're trying to take away something bigger from you.
State Senator Patricia Fahey, a Democrat representing parts of the Capital Region, said the amendment is simply insufficient and lawmakers have more work to do.
I've been a fierce advocate of small businesses here in upstate New York. So with legislation, you want to make sure first do no harm. And I want to make sure that we're not going to be putting the liquor stores out of business.
Lawmakers across the aisle, like State Senator Joseph Grifo, a Republican representing Lewis and Oneida counties, agree.
And we should not be in the business to put small business out of business. So if we can figure a way to bring everybody together where they can compete and survive and thrive, I'm willing to listen and consider that. But at this point in time, I don't believe the law as presented, even with some of the amendments, are sufficient.
State Senator George Borrello, a Republican representing parts of the Finger Lakes, says a better compromise is a bill he sponsors to only allow for the sale of local New York State wine in grocery stores.
New York State has a very robust wine industry, but like every other industry in New York State, it's under strain. So I understand the need. Wine sales globally are down, and I know that the big purveyors of wine are looking for new markets. And New York State is one of only 10 states left in the nation that does not allow the sale of wine in grocery stores, and it's by far the biggest of those 10 states. So there is certainly the temptation, but that's why I offered what I feel is a compromise bill.
But some advocates argue this will likely result in lawsuits and wouldn't necessarily mitigate the problem.
There'll be a lawsuit by the California wineries or the European wineries, and shortly thereafter, that law would get thrown out of court and as being unconstitutional. That would be a challenge to the Commerce Clause and basically say that you can't favor, I'm not a lawyer, but you cannot favor an in-state entity as opposed to an out-state entity. So wine and groceries would immediately happen.
The topic of wine in grocery stores has been fiercely debated and seen a variety of versions for about 2 decades. And even with amendments and other bill options on the table, the future is still unknown. The bill sponsors, Kruger and Hunter, say a big reason the bill has not passed in recent years is the strong opposition. Lawmakers and advocates also say that the state's liquor laws are some of the oldest in the country, still retaining some remnants of the Prohibition era.
So when Prohibition ended, there was this desire by the state to make sure that temperance was the overriding issue, to protect people from the demon rum, as they used to call it. So there were a lot of archaic provisions that they put in the law. You can only own one liquor store. Why can you only own one liquor store? Because they thought there would be one owner who would keep an eye on everybody in the neighborhood. You can't sell food anywhere where you sell alcohol because it was an attractive nuisance, and you could bring kids into these stores and they would end up buying alcohol.
Zuber stresses that times have changed and New Yorkers purchase and consume things differently. And some lawmakers agree.
We're talking about a law that's been on the books for 100 years, and consumers aren't consumers from 100 years ago. And we've definitely seen a change with liquor sales.
Many store owners say the laws have worked for this long and a change isn't needed.
We have been effectively and intelligently managing the dispensation of alcohol and wine since repeal. And this is what the legislature gave us, and this is what we've done. And I think we've done it extremely effectively and extremely well.
Calagrita says they just want to be left alone.
Everything's okay. They don't need to fix anything.
But lawmakers pushing for this bill haven't given up. Hunter says there are ongoing conversations during this off-session time to discuss the language of the bill with stakeholders and possible amendments before next legislative session.
But I do feel confident. I go back to, change is hard, but I think New Yorkers are a very hardy bunch, and obviously we rumble sometimes in order to get legislation across the finish line, but ultimately it will be successful for all parties involved.
Lawmakers won't return to Albany until January, which means they have about 5 months to continue off-session conversations about this bill. Hunter says it's unclear at this point what potential new amendments could look like because conversations are still ongoing. Elise Klein, New York Now.
And for more information on wine in grocery stores, you can visit our website. Again, that's at nynow.org. You can also subscribe to our newsletter by going to newsletter.nynow.org or by scanning the QR code on your screen. Well, that does it for this edition of New York Now. Thank you for tuning in and see you next week.
Funding for New York Now is provided by WNET